On the morning of September the 15th, 1980, a cargo ship called the Cambridgeshire was sailing through the Pacific Ocean south of Japan when her captain received an unusual request. He was asked to hold position, to wait, and then, in the open water where his ship had stopped, to conduct a memorial service. The people he was remembering were not far away. 6 days earlier, 230 miles from the coast of Okinawa, 44 people had been alive on a ship called the MV Derbyshire. A captain with 20 years of experience, 41 crew members, most of them from Liverpool, and 2 women, wives of men who had asked them to come along for the final leg of the voyage, to be waiting in Japan when the ship came in. None of them were found. Not one body, not one life raft, not one piece of wreckage that could tell anyone what had happened in the hours before the Derbyshire went silent. The ship had sent no Mayday, no distress signal of any kind. One moment she was there, the next she was gone. And for the next 14 years, no one in authority seemed particularly interested in finding out why. This is the story of the MV Derbyshire, the largest British ship ever lost at sea, and the families who refused to let her disappear twice. To understand what happened to the Derbyshire, you have to understand what she was. She was not a small vessel. She was not fragile. She was not old. When she left Quebec on July 11, 1980, she was 4 years old, built at the Swan Hunter shipyard in Newcastle to the most demanding specifications available at the time. She stretched 294 meters from bow to stern. That is longer than the Titanic, and longer than 3 football pitches laid end to end. Her 9 cargo holds were each the height of a 7-story building. Her displacement, when fully loaded, was 169,000 tons, more than twice the weight of the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. She was rated A1 at Lloyd's, the highest possible classification for seaworthiness. Her captain was 47 years old. Geoffrey Underhill had spent more than 2 decades at sea. He knew ships. He knew storms. He had sailed through worse than a Pacific typhoon and come home. The Derbyshire was carrying 157,446 tons of iron ore from Quebec to the steelworks at Kawasaki, Japan. It was not a glamorous cargo. It was routine, the kind of voyage she had made many times before. She sailed south through the Atlantic, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Indian Ocean, and entered the Pacific. 8 weeks of open water. The crew had settled into the rhythms of a long passage, watches, meals, maintenance, sleep. For most of them, this was simply the job. Another crossing, another port at the end of it. 2 of the men aboard had their wives with them. The women would disembark in Japan and fly home while their husbands finished the turnaround. One of those wives had already booked her hotel room in Kawasaki. She was looking forward to seeing the city, to the meal they had planned, to a few days together before he sailed again. She never arrived. By early September, Typhoon Orchid had been building in the Western Pacific for almost 2 weeks. It had formed as a tropical depression on September 1st and spent the following days doing something unusual, looping. Not once, but 3 times, cycling back on itself in tight spirals, gaining energy with every rotation. By September 9th, Orchid had reached sustained wind speeds of 150 kilometers per hour. Not the most powerful typhoon ever recorded, but unpredictable in a way that made it particularly dangerous. Captain Underhill had been monitoring Orchid for days, cross-referencing weather reports from Guam, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. A commercial routing service was also feeding him updated forecasts. The problem was that none of them agreed. Each report gave a slightly different track, and each recommended a slightly different course. Underhill had to make a decision based on contradictory information, while his ship was moving. He chose to outrun the storm to the north. It was a reasonable decision given what he knew. He reduced speed, angled the bow against the oncoming swells, a standard technique, and held course. On September 9th, the Derbyshire made radio contact with shore stations. The crew reported severe weather, but there was no distress, no emergency, no indication that the situation was beyond their control. That was the last anyone ever heard from her. When the Derbyshire failed to arrive in Kawasaki on September 15th, her owners at Bibby Line were notified. An official search was launched that same day, 6 days after the last radio contact. 6 days during which no one had raised the alarm. 6 days during which the Derbyshire was simply assumed to be delayed. The search lasted 6 more days. Aircraft and naval vessels swept the area. They found an oil slick, nothing else. No wreckage, no life rafts, no bodies, no signal from the emergency beacons every ship of her class was required to carry. On September 21st, the search was called off. The official conclusion came quickly. The ship had been overwhelmed by Typhoon Orchid. These things happened. The ocean was dangerous. There was nothing more to investigate. 6 weeks later, a Japanese tanker spotted one of the Derbyshire's lifeboats floating in the area. It was empty. Whether it had been launched, torn free, or simply released when the ship went down, no one could say. It was the only physical trace of the Derbyshire ever recovered. 44 people had vanished in a matter of hours, and the official response was to close the file. For the families left behind, that was not acceptable, and they were about to spend the next 14 years proving it. The Derbyshire had sailed with crew drawn largely from Liverpool. In 1980, Liverpool was already a city in economic crisis. The docks were declining, the shipping industry was contracting, and the jobs that remained were precious. The men who sailed on vessels like the Derbyshire were skilled workers with families, mortgages, and children in school. When the Derbyshire disappeared, those families were left with nothing. No bodies to bury, no explanation to grieve over, an insurance system and a legal framework that seemed designed to pay out as little as possible and ask as few questions as necessary. One of those who refused to stop asking was Peter Ridyard. Ridyard had lost a relative aboard the Derbyshire. But unlike most bereaved families, he had a professional advantage. He was a qualified ship surveyor. He knew how vessels were built. He knew how they failed. And when he looked at the Derbyshire's design, he found something that disturbed him. The Derbyshire was the last of 6 ships built to the same design. The bridge class, combination carriers built to carry oil, bulk cargo, and ore. In 1982, 18 months after she vanished, one of her sister ships was brought into dry dock after a heavy weather encounter. Engineers found something alarming. The deck plating at a structural point called Frame 65 had begun to crack. Not surface cracking. Deep structural fractures running meters into the steel. The other bridge-class ships were inspected. Every single one showed the same cracks in the same location. Ridyard took this to the Department of Transport. He argued that the Derbyshire had not simply been overwhelmed by a typhoon. She had been structurally compromised from the beginning, and the storm had exposed it. The Department of Transport declined to reopen the investigation. There was nothing more to discuss. In 1984, the families formed the Derbyshire Family Association, a small organization with no resources and no legal standing, run by people who were grieving, furious, and determined. They lobbied members of Parliament, attended Maritime hearings, and collected tens of thousands of signatures. They did not have to wait long for the industry to hand them something they could use. In November 1986, another bridge-class ship, the Kowloon Bridge, broke apart in the Atlantic off the Irish coast. There were fractures at frame 65. The pattern was now impossible to ignore. The British government opened a formal inquiry in 1987. For 6 months, engineers, lawyers, and naval architects presented testimony. Peter Ridyard was not permitted to present his research. The families sat in the public gallery and listened to experts argue about wave heights, hatch strengths, and the precise meteorological conditions of Typhoon Orchid. In January 1989, the inquiry published its findings. No evidence of structural failure. An act of nature. Unfortunate. Unpreventable. Over. The families walked out of the courtroom and kept fighting. By 1994, they had found an unlikely alleyway, the International Transport Workers Federation, a global union representing seafarers across dozens of countries. Its members had a direct interest in the case. Because if the bridge-class design was flawed, there were other ships built to similar specifications still sailing. Other crews, other families who might one day find themselves in the same position. The ITF agreed to fund a search for the wreck. British officials had long maintained that finding the Derbyshire would be impossible. Deep water, open ocean, no precise coordinates. In May 1994, a team chartered the search ship Shin-Kai Maru and deployed a sonar vehicle to sweep the ocean floor. They found her in 23 hours. She was lying 4,200 meters below the surface, 2.5 miles down, scattered across the seabed in a debris field that stretched for kilometers. She had broken apart on the way down, the pressure tearing her hull apart as she fell through the dark water. The images from the remotely operated camera were haunting. Hatch covers buckled on the ocean floor, hull plating torn and deformed. At the center of the debris field, the huge bow section of the Derbyshire lay at rest, half buried in the sediment. A bronze plaque was lowered to the wreck. It bore the names of the 44 people who had died aboard her. The families had found their ship. Now they needed to understand what had killed her. The British government agreed to fund a forensic investigation. Over the following months, investigators catalogued 125,774 photographs of the wreck site. The initial findings, published in 1998, blamed the crew. A small store hatch on the forward deck appeared to have been left unsecured. If true, water had entered during Typhoon Orchid and begun the chain of events that sank the ship. A fatal human error. The families rejected this immediately. They were not going to accept a verdict that blamed those men for their own deaths, not when the evidence was a single photograph of a hatch and a rope. They went back to court. The final investigation began in April 2000 and lasted 54 days, one of the longest maritime inquiries in British history. This time, the investigators had the full photographic record of the wreck. They had testimony from naval architects, oceanographers, and structural engineers. And they had a new understanding of the forces that Typhoon Orchid had actually exerted on the ship. The conclusion, when it came, was definitive. The hatch had not been left open. The rope was debris. The crew had done nothing wrong. What had killed the Derbyshire was not negligence, it was physics. Typhoon Orchid had battered the forward deck with waves far beyond anything the ventilation covers were designed to withstand. The small vent covers near the bow, built for a static pressure of less than 2 meters, were being hit by waves generating more than 10 times that load. One by one, they failed. Water entered the forward compartments, pulling the bow deeper with each wave. As it dropped, the main cargo hatch covers, each one the size of a tennis court, came under pressure. It was never supposed to reach. The number 1 hatch gave way first. Thousands of tons of seawater poured in. The number 2 hatch failed, then the 3rd, then all the remaining hatches in rapid succession, each driven inward by the weight of water above it. The Derbyshire sank so fast that the crew had no time to respond, no time to send a Mayday, no time to do anything except face what was coming. She was gone in minutes. The investigation found that the flush deck design had made the forward ventilation covers fatally vulnerable. The hatches had been built to standards that were inadequate for the conditions ships like the Derbyshire routinely encountered. It found that the Derbyshire had been sent to sea in a ship that was not built to survive the ocean it was sailing. The Derbyshire Family Association presented 25 recommendations for improving bulk carrier safety. 22 were adopted. 20 became law. Hatch cover standards were overhauled worldwide. Ventilation requirements were strengthened. The flush deck design that had made the Derbyshire so vulnerable was changed. In the decade that followed, the rate at which bulk carriers were lost at sea fell by more than half. Ships that would have sunk came home. Crews that would have been lost walked off the gangway and went back to their families. None of them knew the names of the people who had made that possible. 42 crew members from Liverpool and the north of England. 2 women who had come along to see Japan, to have a few days together. They are all still down there, 4,200 meters below the surface of the Pacific. The plaque is still there, too. In Liverpool, a memorial garden was dedicated in September 2018 at the Church of Our Lady and St. Nicholas, the sailors' church that has stood at the waterfront for 6 centuries. The families gathered there for the first time with something they had spent almost 40 years trying to obtain. Not the ship, not the men, just the truth. The MV Derbyshire left Quebec on July 11, 1980. She was 4 years old, the largest ship of her kind Britain had ever built. Her captain was experienced and careful. Her crew were qualified and professional. 2 of them had brought their wives. None of them came home. And for 14 years, the official position of the British government was that there was nothing more to say. It took the families of the dead to prove that there was. The sea does not always give back what it takes, but sometimes, if you push long enough and hard enough, it tells you why. There are more stories beneath the surface than history ever recorded. Subscribe, and we'll find them.